All right, so I have another video that's beginner friendly for you all. I'm going to show you how to make a Fahrenheit to Celsius converter using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. More specifically, this is a mainly focus on JavaScript and HTML. There's not really much styling going on, but if you don't know how to do this yourself, I highly recommend that you watch this and try to build this out for yourself, because understanding how to build something simple like this is basically what you need to do to be able to achieve working your way up to something like React or building larger web applications. So what we have here is you type in the Fahrenheit, click convert, and it prints out a number. So this is super basic. Let's just go ahead and dive into the implementation and try to figure this out. So the first thing I'm going to do is scaffold out an index.html file, and if I just do an exclamation mark inside VS Code and click enter, that should kind of build it out. And secondly, let's change this title to like Fahrenheit converter. And we can try to start building out the HTML. So in the body, what we really need is we need an input box where you can type in the Fahrenheit. So I'm going to say input placeholder, and I'm going to go ahead and put the placeholder of Fahrenheit. Go ahead and save that. And you'll see that that input box came up, and the attribute placeholder is how you can put this like inner text. So when someone types, that'll go away. It just kind of shows the user like what they can type into that input box. And secondly, let's just go ahead and give this an ID of, let's just say Fahrenheit as well, with a lowercase f. And we're going to use this ID later on to basically grab the value of that the user typed into the input box. So after we have an input, let's just go ahead and add a button too. And we can give this an ID of like convert. And I'm going to go ahead and put convert inside of that button. So now we have an input box and we have a convert button that doesn't do anything when we click it, but we're going to add that functionality in just a second. And then lastly, let's add a span with an ID of Celsius. And this is going to be empty, but what we're going to do is we're going to put that text into that span once we've done that conversion. So now that we have these three input, or these three DOM elements, let's just go ahead and make a script tag near the end of the body. And we're going to make a function that we can call to basically run a conversion function. So I'm going to say function convert. And that is going to be a function that takes no parameters. And we just need to do a couple things here. So the first thing we need to do is fetch the value from the input. Second thing we probably need to do is convert it to Celsius. And then the last thing is display the number. Okay, so those are the main things we need to do in this function. Let's go ahead and figure out how to do this. So the first one is fetch the value from the input. Well, it turns out whenever you're dealing with JavaScript, and you have a browser accessible, you can actually access something called document. And that is an object that has a bunch of methods on it. And one of the methods that we use a lot is called Git Element by ID. And we can pass in a string here that matches whatever ID that we want. So in this case, we have ID of Fahrenheit. Let's go ahead and fetch that by ID of Fahrenheit, and that should give back the input box. Now we actually need to get the value that the user types. So you can just do .value on that. And that'll give you whatever the user types. So if they type in 212, this will be 212. I'm also going to put that in a variable here so we can actually use it later on. So let's just go ahead and console log this to make sure that this is all working. I definitely recommend that along the way as you're coding to console log everything that you add in. So if I type in 212 and click convert, nothing actually happens. And the reason is because we haven't actually added an onclick listener to this button. So one attribute you can add to buttons is something called onclick. And when the user actually clicks on this button, you can call a function. So I'm going to go ahead and call convert. And now try that again. If I do 212, click convert, you'll see that it prints out 212 here. One thing I'll point out is that if you were to print out type of, you'll notice that this is actually going to print out string. But we actually want this to be a number so that we can do some type of calculations on it. So I'm going to take this value that's returned from this and just wrap this whole thing in another function called parseInt. This is a global function that's available to you in JavaScript, but it'll take a string that happens to be a number and convert it to a number. So now if we do type of here, you'll see the value is a number. So the next step is we need to convert this to Celsius. So there happens to be a formula you can use to do this. Let's just copy this formula and use it. So I'm going to say, so for step 2, let's just do const Celsius is equal to, and I'll say value, and then I'm going to paste that formula in. So I'm going to say value minus 32, and then I need to multiply that by that decimal value. All right, it also makes sense to maybe convert this to say Fahrenheit, not value. So I'm going to do this. All right, so now we have the Fahrenheit that came from the input box. We converted it to Celsius. Let's make sure this actually prints out correctly as well. So let's add a console log, type 212, click convert. And that is close enough. 212 point something is boiling in Fahrenheit. And this is basically boiling. You can also check 32 and make sure that it prints out 0. So I think the conversion is working fine. The last step is we just need to display it, right? So again, we can use this Git Element by ID to get this span here. Notice we gave this an ID of Celsius. So we could use this function and pass it Celsius as the argument here. And that'll give us that span element. And all we need to do is change the inner text of that span to equal our Celsius variable that we created here. So let's just go ahead and run this code and make sure this works as well. So 212, and that prints out 100 over here. 32, and that prints out. Hopefully that made sense. We basically just created some elements. We made a function that's going to be invoked when you click on the convert button. We fetched the Fahrenheit from the input box. We converted it to Celsius using that formula that we found over here online. And then finally, we get the span on the page that has the ID of Celsius. And we just display the inner text to that Celsius we calculated. So all of this stuff is really important to understand because these are the building blocks of building larger applications using vanilla JavaScript. Or if you wanted to migrate to something like React, Vue, or Angular, you need to understand how some of this stuff kind of works, especially this logic part. So that's about it. If you enjoyed watching this little video, be sure to give me a thumbs up. Also, leave a comment below if you have another small little JavaScript project idea that we can do together to help you understand JavaScript better and just how logic maybe works in a web browser and stuff like that. And like always, if you're new to this channel, be sure to click that subscribe button because I'm going to have other videos like this that should hopefully help you become a better JavaScript and web developer in the future. Have a good day and happy coding.